Okay, so let's continue with the first part of week 2 for Node.js course. So in the first part, we are going to talk about REST on a high level. Now, why we are talking about this is before we start writing web applications, we need to discuss how we are going to structure and architect our applications in a good way that is understandable for other developers. So software development has a technical side to it, but also an architectural side to it. And whenever we build applications, we need to make sure we follow some standards and practices that are established in the community. And one of these standards that is established is called REST. And this REST standard guides us in the way we design and build our web application. So I know this sounds a bit abstract, and as we move through this week and next week, I hope this will become much more clear. But for now, let's stay on this abstract level and discuss what REST means. So the idea around REST centers around the concept of resources. So a resource is any object, real or imaginary, that the web server has some knowledge about. For example, on Instagram, a resource can be a user, a photo, or a hashtag. What REST does is offers a common way to work with these resources to get information about them. For example, I'm going to continue with Instagram here. We can get some information on the user, which is a resource. Uh, then we can also check how many posts that user has on Instagram, how many followers they have, and so forth. All the information that Instagram has for that resource. And what's important is that there are different types of resources. As I said, for example, a user, then you have a photo resource, and so forth. And to identify a certain user, they all are assigned unique identifiers. This could be numbers or some other form of identification. But it's important to distinguish between the resource as a group of objects, such as users, and a specific user that we are requesting information for. In addition to getting information, REST also provides a standard way to take some common actions on these resources. Most notably is the action to create a new resource, for example, creating a new user, and also changing a resource, for example, editing a post on Instagram. The term REST might be a bit confusing. The R in REST is not for resource, but actually stands for representational state transfer. So it's REST. And the meaning of this is that when the client requests information about a resource, the server will transfer to the client a representation of the state of that resource. So the way that we talk about things when we are building web application is guided by these REST concepts. And the two main REST concepts again are the resources. So when we want to build a web application, the first thing we need to think about what kind of resources we have on them. And then the second part of REST is the operations. And so when we are building a web application, we need to think about, okay, for which resources, what kind of operations I want to do on them. Do I want to be able to create them? Do I want to be able to edit them, change them? And what kind of information can I get for which resource? Um, okay, so I know again this is very abstract, but I would like to take another example in addition to Instagram and talk about the different types uh, of resources with another example. Let's take, for example, Facebook. there you have resources. Again, you have users, and this is a very common resources. Almost all web applications have some form of users. Then on Facebook, you can have posts for that user. Now, if you think about the kind of operations that you can do, so users you can create, and maybe, yeah, you can create users whenever a new user logs in. Posts, when you create the post, they're always connected to a specific user, and you can also delete posts. It might be a bit more difficult to delete a user, for example. And then you also have, for every post, maybe you have comments, and comments can also be created, updated, or deleted. So, and there might be other types of resources that Facebook accommodates. But if we think about the core ones, these would be the core resources that you have to have a social media platform such as Facebook. So maybe it will help if I write these things down. So Facebook resources are users. Then we have posts. We have comments on those posts, and so forth. We have also all kinds of other resources. For example, we have groups that you can create. There are events that you can create, and so forth. And a large website will have many different kinds of resources, and they can all be managed using REST. And REST is the principal way how all the modern websites are organized. They're all centered around this idea of resources. Now, I want to ask you to think about and write down what kind of resources will be needed if or what kind of resources does GitHub have or would make sense to have. So do not go and check the GitHub website, just think for yourself what kind of resources would GitHub need to have. So you work with GitHub all the time, so think about what kind of objects there make sense to be a resource. So and I will give you the easiest one, and that's the users. But what additional resources does GitHub have? So go ahead and write down at least 3 resources that you can think of for GitHub. I hope you're done thinking. So the most common resource that you see on GitHub, and you always go to it, maybe even without thinking, because it's so central to GitHub, is the concept of a repository, right? And then for every repository, you usually have branches on the repository. So that's another resource. And yet another one is commits. So uh, every there can be commits in different branches for that same repository. Yet another one might be pull requests, which we do when you submit your homework. Now there are many other resources, so if you set a resource that's not here on the list, that's still good as long as it makes sense in the context of GitHub. So that's the idea behind the resources. Now a bit more concrete about how. Oh no, let's leave that for another lecture where we talk more concrete things. So for now, this is enough to give you an idea about REST.